It's an absolute honor and a pleasure to invite our featured speaker, Mr. Christopher Sinckler, to address us. Mr. Sinckler needs no introduction in Barbados, but I shall nevertheless share some background information on him. He serves as alternate executive director for Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Canada, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, Ireland, Jamaica, St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Vincent at the Grenadines, at the World Bank Group since May 2nd, 2022. He's an international trade and development specialist with over 25 years of experience working in public, private, and civil society sectors in Barbados, the Caribbean, and wider afield. He was also the former Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs of Barbados from 2010 to 2018, when he served as Governor of the World Bank, IMF, Inter-American Development Bank, and the Caribbean Development Bank. He was a Minister of Social Care, Constituency Empowerment, Urban and Rural Development from 2008 to 2010, and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Trade, and International Business in 2008. Immediately before joining the World Bank, Mr. Sinckler was the lead consultant with Tashenico Consultants, Inc., a private consultancy advisory service, and he serves as CPDC's consultant policy advisor on debt relief and development finance architecture reform. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Political Science and a Master of Science degree in International Trade Policy from the University of the West Indies. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Mr. Sinckler to the stage on the occasion of the 8th Leo Leacock Memorial Lecture to address us on the topic, the role of small firms in the development agenda for small island development states. Mr. Sinckler?
Thank you very much, Master of Ceremonies, Noveline Brewster. Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Small Business Association, Mr. Charles Carter, who I must say I did share a copy of my speech with, and he decided to deliver part of it. So I am going to skip that part. No, seriously, I did not, but it sounds quite familiar to me. Directors of the Board of Management for the SBA. Of course, my colleague, Honorable Minister in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, Ryan Strawn, who is here with us. Thank you very much for coming. Of course, the Executive Director of Caribbean Export, who we just heard and who delivered the other part of my speech. Thank you very much. CEO of the SBA, Dr. Lynette Holder, representatives of the Leacock family, members of the staff of the SBA, specially invited guests, members of the media, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant, and should I say a warm, and it is quite warm in Barbados. A good evening to all of you. First, let me take the opportunity to extend my appreciations to the leadership and members of the Small Business Association for the very kind invitation for me to deliver this 8th Leo Leacock Memorial Lecture. I am humbled by the gracious author and, of course, excited for the opportunity to share just a few thoughts on this very important topic, which, of course, is receiving very robust attention globally and, of course, in national jurisdictions. It has not escaped my attention that the lecture is being held in this building, which, of course, is named after one of the great pioneers of post-independence Barbados, Right Excellent, National Hero, Right Excellent, Errol Walton Barrow, and being held as well in the name of, as you have heard, one of the great pioneers of black business and entrepreneurship in Barbados, in post-independence Barbados. Of course, Mr. Barrow's legacy is much well known and spoken about. Mr. Leacock's, for a lot of people in Barbados, particularly the newer generations, might not be as known, but is no less significant and important. And therefore, I think given his tremendous contribution and leadership to the development of post-independence Barbados in industry, commerce, and business at a time when we could say it was difficult and challenging and very exclusionary, should be celebrated as much as we can, and of course spread for generations to come. As you heard, I am the alternate executive director. They say alternate, but it is really deputy executive director for Canada, Ireland, and the Caribbean, and I wouldn't call all the states because Novaline did that for me. The other states from the Caribbean that we do not represent would be Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, Dominican Republic, and Haiti, who caucus with the Brazilian executive director's chair and constituency office. But of course, as CARICOM, we speak and we act as one at the executive board. And as such, in doing so, both the director and myself cover a number of disciplines spanning financial, economic, social, and environmental programs and projects, and of course, policies that advance the development priorities of the states we represent. In this regard, it is our remit to ensure that our members get fair and unfettered access to over $120 billion a year that the World Bank expends through loans and grants in execution of its mandate to end extreme poverty and build shared prosperity among nations. Currently, for the Caribbean, our constituents within the constituency I represent have an aggregate value of $2.9 billion under contract with the World Bank for various projects and programs. And so, as you could well imagine, that is quite an important task to monitor and ensure that those projects and programs are executed fully and to the benefit of all of our citizens. This is a responsibility that we take quite seriously. The third bit of housekeeping that I would want to do, and we are bound to say this, and this is the best part, board officials are legally bound, and honestly, I must say this, so I have to read this as is, legally bound at the beginning of presentations such as this to issue the disclaimer that any views during the presentation are entirely personal and do not represent the official views of our policy positions of the World Bank, its management, or executive board, or the governments we represent, by the way. So you're quite okay, Ryan, in this regard. So please let the record reflect that. That is a disclaimer that when you're doing the onboarding process, they tell you very clearly you must say at every presentation. My friends, that having been said and out of the way, the multilateral development system is under serious threat. Indeed, some keen observers have already determined that in its current state, it will not, and I repeat, will not be able to deliver on the inclusive and balanced development objectives as identified in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, as part of the 2030 Agenda for Action. Indeed, based on recent assessments, by all major internationally agreed development compacts, be they Paris on climate, Addis Ababa on financing for development, Samoa's pathway for small island developing states, transformation of the environment through the Rio Agreement, are all in serious trouble of not being delivered. If this is so, and the data is showing it, then the fallout for developing countries around the world, especially for the small and vulnerable ones, could be quite significant as we face the prospect of falling behind in the fight against poverty, income inequality, socio-economic marginalization, environmental degradation, and underdevelopment. To be certain, given the multiple and cascading shocks and crises facing the world and directly impacting our space as small states, there is a serious threat that we could lose ground already covered in providing a better life for our peoples. What is even more troubling is that the very global institutions mandated to finance and otherwise help with the attainment of these goals now seem caught in a vortex of a more unstable and chaotic global environment and a weakening appetite for multilateralism. Financial resources are clearly inadequate. Operational systems, though useful in the past, now seem unfit for purpose, while national policymakers are hemmed in by high debt, lack of fiscal space, and inadequate access to cost-effective capital to pursue development priorities. Meanwhile, as progress on the SDGs slow, the climate crisis is getting worse, and annually, lives and billions of dollars are being lost in developed and developing countries alike. The UN expert panel on climate is predicting, for example, that the current trajectory, we will not meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target to stabilize and reverse global warming as major greenhouse gas emitting countries fail to meet agreed targets. Equally, poverty levels are rising precipitously. The debt crisis is in full effect in much of the developing world, and the geopolitical tensions are escalating as a seeming realignment of the political and economic world order gathers momentum. In all of this, small island developing states, SIDS, continue to scream at the top of our voices for attention and urgent intervention at policy, financial, and operational levels. The lack of resources and policy space to drive their efforts at economic stabilization and growth, build greater resilience to future shocks, especially from climate, and continue to work transforming the lives and livelihoods of millions in our respective countries are becoming intractable problems. We believe that failure of the international community to act on these clear and legitimate demands will not only ensure failure to meet the commitments to the UN SDGs, but in a real way reverse the significant progress we've made over the last 50 years in fighting poverty and marginalization and securing socio-economic advancement in our region. And the empirical evidence, some of which I will share with you tonight, is clear that SIDS have been disproportionately impacted by the major crises of recent times, and our rates of recovery are slower than most. Therefore, in these states, we stand to lose much more than our bigger developing country partners and, of course, the developed and industrialized world. It would seem then to me, as I hope it would seem to you, that the clarity, consistency, and collectiveness that is required in the cases we espouse through the centers of power internationally for action urgently requires attention. I believe that in many respects, we are seeing significant steps in that direction through the efforts of our own Prime Minister, Mayor Amar Motley, and her challenge to world leaders for transformational change of the global development financial architecture and the institutions that govern it. Certainly, the Bridgetown Initiative, along with strong advocacy that has accompanied it, has captured the attention of key decision makers, but more persistent efforts will be required to push sensible, inclusive, and ambitious reform. This is a task which all organizations in small states must join to advance internationally. Equally, within our respective domestic spaces, we have to move forward with purpose on a whole-of-country basis to not only tackle the major challenges that we face, but to maximize the myriad opportunities that abound. In this regard, it cannot go without mention that your sector, small business, small and medium-sized business sector, being one that has shown such levels of resilience, transformation, innovation, empowerment, diversification, and inclusiveness, must be in the forefront of helping our countries build new sustainable pathways for national development and, of course, for economic growth. It is the imperative of our time, and failure is not an option. So, ladies and gentlemen, the facts don't lie. This past week, the leaders from around the world, well, most of them, gathered at the United Nations headquarters in New York to attend several critical meetings as part of the 65th United Nations General Assembly, UNGA. One of the key sessions was a midterm review of the efforts of countries to achieve the SDGs. This is a sort of a stock-taking exercise, if you will. And at the opening of that event, the Secretary General delivered these words, and I really want to quote them because they are so telling. Some of you might have heard it before, but I feel I must repeat it. And he said, and I quote, 8 years ago, member states gathered in this hall to adopt sustainable development goals. With the world watching, you made a solemn promise, a promise to build a world of health, progress, and opportunity for all, a promise to leave no one behind, a promise to pay for it. This was not a promise made to each other as diplomats. It was a promise to the people. People crushed under the wheels of poverty, people starving in a world of plenty, children denied a seat in a classroom, families fleeing conflicts and seeking a better life. Parents watching helplessly as children die from preventable diseases. People losing hope because they can't find a job or safety net when they need it. Entire communities literally on devastation's doorstep because of climate change. So the SDGs are not just goals. They carry the hope, dreams, rights, expectations of people everywhere. Yet, today, only 15% of the targets are on track, and many are going in reverse. Instead of leaving no one behind, we risk leaving the SDGs behind. So, Excellencies, the SDGs need a rescue plan, unquote. The following day, a high-level political forum, the same leaders on sustainable development, confirmed that the SDGs were, in fact, devilishly off track. And in a recent policy brief entitled Human Costs of Inaction, Poverty, and Social Protection and Debt Servicing 2020 to 2023, UNDP said that in the 3 years since COVID, rates of poverty have surged in low and middle-income countries. And they estimate that more than 165 million people are now living on less than $3.65 US per day, which is the internationally accepted benchmark for measuring poverty. The truth is that even before the pandemic, analysts and policymakers alike were sounding the alarm that many of the advances of the previous 3 or 4 decades, which lifted close to 1 billion people out of poverty, were dramatically slowing. And a large part of this was associated with the frequent exogenous shocks associated with the climate crisis, commodity price volatility, and a crippling debt crisis among developing countries. On the climate end, conservative estimates put the loss and damage across the world in the trillions of dollars, while on the debt side, the IMF has determined that in developing countries, close to 20% of national revenues was now being spent on debt servicing, which according to the UNDP means that less investments are going into health, education, social protection, the provision of clean water, and social safety nets. To make matters worse, Russia's war with Ukraine or in Ukraine and its related spillovers, including elevated oil and food commodity prices and continued supply chain disruptions, some of which started during COVID, have now overlapped with high inflation and escalating interest rates with devastating impacts. Developing countries already buckling under the pressure of lack of fiscal space now find themselves defenseless against the exogenous shocks whose frequency and occurrence and prolongation appear to be getting worse. So the World Bank, the agency that I have time to hang around with nowadays, which is the leading development finance institution, projects that it will take $2.4 trillion per year to fight climate, pandemics, and conflicts from now to 2030, while the UN Secretary General is calling for an additional $500 billion a year as an SDG stimulus package. So where do SIDS fit in all of this? You may ask yourself, therefore, what is our state and condition? How is the Caribbean, which has a significant collection of island economies, faring? I'm afraid the news is mixed and in some instances not much better. In its 2022 Global Economic Prospects Report, which was released in January this year, World Bank analysts dedicated a full chapter in that document for a closer examination of SIDS and how they have been impacted on by the overlapping crises. And it surmised its findings as follows, and I quote, "Small state economies were hit particularly hard by COVID-19 due to prolonged disruptions in global tourism. Now facing spillovers from Russia's invasion of Ukraine and global monetary tightening cycles, small states are expected to have weak recoveries with large and possible permanent losses in the level of output. Small states are diverse in their economic features, but they share attributes that make them especially vulnerable to shocks, including dependence on imports of essential goods, highly concentrated economies, elevated levels of debt, reliance on external financing, and susceptibility to natural disasters and climate change," unquote. They opined that the aggregate GDP in small states will only exceed the 2019 level in 2023, which is this year, 2 years after emerging market developing economies received and achieved the same. And by the end of 2023, GDP in small states such as Barbados and others in the Caribbean is projected to be 7% below the pre-pandemic forecast, which is pre-2020, 2019, or thereabouts, away from their much larger, or when compared to their much larger counterparts in other developing countries. And they conclude by saying that within the Caribbean small states constituency in particular, there is early evidence pointing to an unwelcome situation in which some impacts from the pandemic will leave permanent scars on potential future growth and hobble development advances. So that among the tourism-based economies, the ones that we represent and have the honor to live in and call home, growth is projected to be above the historical level of 2000 to 2019 on average through 2024. However, these growth rates follow a severe recession of nearly 13% in 2020. That is, the dip that we took in COVID was so significant because of the nature of our economy relying on tourism and openness to trade and so forth and so on. It effectively means that we are taking much longer to get back to where we are. And we've seen in Barbados, in Trinidad, in Jamaica, some of the most robust levels of growth over the last year. But even that is not propelling us to the stage where we need to be at pre-COVID. Another area of concern is that related to the debt crisis, which has worsened since COVID. Small states, high debt burdens, and heavy reliance on foreign financing exacerbate the challenges of the current global environment of rising inflation and tightening monetary policies. And given that most of SIDS debt instruments are denominated in US dollars, currency movements, in this case an appreciation of the US dollar, and or the Federal Reserve tightening its monetary policy by increasing interest rates, have tended to have a negative blow on our financial sectors. It increases the cost of financing for sovereigns and private companies, which sharply increases debt service costs as well. We already see the evidence of that on our countries going forward. It means that with every dollar used to pay increased debt, servicing costs because of interest rate increases, or because of the appreciation of the US dollar, it is $1 less that is spending on education, healthcare, infrastructure, renewal, and so forth. And given the fact that preliminary research data is also showing clear signs of significant losses in education because of COVID, relative to the time which students did not have to spend in a classroom before a teacher and having that direct instruction, which is so important. The research is showing that there have been significant, what we call learning losses that we have to catch up from. Then coupled with the increase in non-communicable disease rates, which is putting a burden on the health system and causing for additional resources to be spent on healthcare and healthcare systems. And then the persistent high cost of living challenges because of supply chain disruptions, increase in oil prices and commodity prices and so forth, due to events beyond our control, entirely beyond our control. It means that there will be a deepening of poverty if governments are not in a position to intervene to assist. And of course, you remember, governments have fiscal constraints. They don't have the, as the Prime Minister would say, the elbow room to do a lot of the things which they have had to do. And I sit on the World Bank board, as you know, and one of the big questions that come up every time there is an issue at the bank, relative to countries like ours that do subsidies, and Ryan can tell you about this, the first thing they say, you have to discontinue the subsidies. You have to bring that assistance because they see all assistance to small people, to the average fella in the street, to the Small Business Association, and to small businesses in particular, as we're here. They see that as subsidies. They don't see that as a protecting and guarding of people. Never mind that when the crisis hit in the developed world, they spent $36 trillion propping up their economies, printing money. Probably should use that term. That's not a term that I should use in Barbados. But nobody spoke about that. But when we do it, if we have to carry people to hold their hand, the first thing they do is push back. When are the subsidies going to come? When are you going to phase them out? But for us, these are not just subsidies. This is really helping ordinary people to withstand the devastation of the crises that we face, whether pandemic, climate, increased costs for energy, for food, or whatever the case may be. So that is a real situation that we face. And therefore, our task is made even more difficult when the rules that apply to others are not the rules that apply to us. So therefore, in the context of all of that, we then have to deal with climate because of the changes in weather systems, the strengthening and more devastation of weather systems. And we know that this is a problem because a single event for a few hours can wipe out an entire island's GDP. We saw that with Dominica. They lost multiples of GDP. 200% of their GDP was wiped out in a few hours because of a storm, Hurricane Maria. And in the Bahamas, a similar thing where over 200% of their GDP was wiped out as well. So we know that this situation with climate is extremely serious for us. Indeed, the IMF estimates that in the past 15 years, climate events alone have actually cost the Caribbean $30 billion in loss. Not 30 million, not 300 million, not 3 billion, $30 billion in loss. How do you possibly recover from that in circumstances where You can't generate the resources, you don't have the fiscal space, and you have to go into the private capital market and elsewhere and borrow at rates that are so exorbitant, it forces you back into the situation of debt that you want to get out of. The reconstruction costs, the social infrastructure costs, the physical infrastructure, the social infrastructure, the mental costs of having to deal with a after post-disaster event, what is causing tremendous difficulties for us, disruption of supply chains. And you know, a natural disaster event does not have to occur in one of our countries to affect us, you know. You who are business people know very well that if a storm hits Florida and they have to shut down that eastern seaboard part of the United States, Florida and right up, that your goods and services that you have to import will be held up in some port in Florida and can't get down here. You know that the increased cost of having to process that through the supply chain will be tremendous. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a direct hit on us. We could be collateral damage in the context of a disaster. And that is why these things are of such tremendous importance for us. So that we know from the research that we are hardest hit, we fall the farthest, we are taking longer than anybody else to recover, we don't have the resources, and therefore we are put in a highly, acutely disadvantageous position. No wonder then that when the UNDP did its analysis on the SDGs, it found that several of our countries in the Caribbean who started, some of them like Barbados, Bahamas, and so forth and so on, slightly ahead of the game, where education, healthcare, and so forth and so on is concerned, have now been experiencing a slowdown in the progress that we have been making. And of course, in some instances, in the Caribbean and elsewhere, a reversal. So now we are trending, according to UNDP, below where we ought to be, as only 20% of the targets are on track. Another 80% are either very limitedly on track or completely off track altogether. This is not good. So you ask yourself the question then, what role for small states in this entire, for small firms, sorry, in this entire milieu that we are painting? And sorry to be so ghastly and ghostly about it, but the facts are in fact the facts. So what role for small states in this challenging environment? You know, you've heard a lot of it from my colleague from Caribbean Export. But according to the World Bank, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises play a most robust role in all economies, developed and developing countries, but particularly in developing countries. SMEs account for the majority of registered businesses worldwide and are important contributors to job creation and global economic development. They represent 90% of all businesses registered and more than 50% of the employment worldwide. Formal SMEs contribute up to 40% of national income in emerging economies. And these numbers will be slightly larger if you include the informal sector as well. In fact, in emerging economies and small economies like ours, SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, create 7 in 10 jobs. So we must not get ourselves fuzzy about it. The jobs that are being created now are not being created by big companies. They're being created by small companies like you guys in Barbados and elsewhere. The executive director for the International Trade Center, Pamela Coke Hamilton, who of course, Minister, who's just joined us, Minister Lisa Cummins, and I know very well from our days as students of the Masters in International Trade. She made the following comment, that at a time, and I quote, that at a time when many trend lines of global stability are shifting into reverse, Micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises are important partners and agents for change that can help get sustainable development goals back on track. You hear that? Back on track. MSMEs are playing a critical role in creating 600 million jobs needed to meet the demands of a growing global workforce by 2030. SMEs and smallholder farmer associations, organizations, also comprise the majority of the world's food producers and are critical to sustainable agri-value food chains in many countries. They are drivers of innovation, creativity, new technologies, and making them catalysts towards attaining more sustainable production and consumption systems, unquote. And here in our region, it is estimated, and I think my colleague made that point, that 70% and 85% of all enterprises in CDB-borrowing member countries are small businesses. They also contribute between 60 to 70% of GDP and account for approximately 50% of employment. In Jamaica, for example, small businesses account for about 80% of employment, and in Barbados, small business sector remains an engine for growth in the modern Barbadian economy, contributing approximately 60% to the island's GDP and facilitates 48% of total employment. So that small firms contribute largely to job creation, poverty alleviation, meaningful innovations, and technological advancements, and a significant reduction in social dislocation that allows countries to pivot in times of national crisis or challenge, even where adverse circumstances exist from exogenous shocks to their larger counterparts. So it is small businesses, really, that are playing that significant, I should say, supporting role, but in many respects, leading role in propping up our economies when they face challenge. You are the people who are really contributing to keeping the thing stable. Former Prime Minister, late Prime Minister, Honorable Owenarf used to talk about an internal stabilizer. In times of difficulties, you need to have something, some sector that is able to withstand the difficulties and keep the system going, while at a macro level, this is micro, while at a macro level, the government sorts out the issues and challenges that it faces. I respectfully submit that not just in Barbados, but throughout the Caribbean and in many small island developing states, if not all, the small and medium-sized business sector is that internal stabilizer. And therefore, you should not forsake or take lightly your role and responsibility in building and continuing to help grow the development of our countries, per se. We know that you've been impacted by the global pandemic because the evidence is showing it. Again, ICT showed that 60% of small-sized businesses, small and micro-sized businesses, and 57% of small businesses generally were affected by the pandemic compared to 43% for large firms. So we know that you have been affected by it, but we've seen a rate of recovery that demonstrates that you are nimble and flexible and able to withstand shocks. So these vulnerabilities, though real, cannot and should not and have not been facing the small business sector. So that we believe that in the context of this, it is absolutely critical for us to ensure that whether it is on climate, debt treatment, development finance, architecture reform, especially in terms of concessional resources, gender equity, food and nutrition and security policy, that your sector must take a leading role in pushing in national governments and pushing international organizations to force change to ensure that our countries are able not just to be heard, but their acts acted on. And you need not invent the wheel or reinvent the wheel, because the Bridgetown Initiative is a clear, crystal well-coordinated and argued instrument for change in the international financial development architecture and the institutions that govern it. Now, I wouldn't detail Bridgetown because I know most of you know it. You probably know it better than I do. But there are a couple of things that I think that we have to pay attention to. The first is that Bridgetown calls for the provision of immediate liquidity support, including the releasing of $100 billion of unused special drawing rights. And I think I have to stick a pin and talk about this. During the crisis of the pandemic, the directors of the International Monetary Fund decided, look, we got to help countries. So we are going to issue what they call special drawing rights, which is a special internal currency of the bank to which the monetary authorities of the countries, that is the central banks, can get access to. So they decided to issue $650 billion, $650 billion to help countries through the COVID, to buy vaccines, to strengthen their systems and so forth and so on. Would you believe it? That 80% of that funding went to the countries who did not need it. And only 20% went to the smaller countries, went to the developing countries, including the small states. Absolutely amazing. So countries who did not use it and have not used it because they didn't need it, they parked it in their central banks, as Ryan would tell you, and they stargaze at it. While telling us, but you need help. But they did not change the system because of shareholding. So the United States, for example, in the World Bank holds 36% of the shares. In the IMF, they hold 40% of the shares. So they got the lion's share of it. A country that voted a stimulus package through its Congress on request from President Biden of close to $2 trillion. And they went back for another $1.8 billion. They did not need the $200 or $300 billion that they got from the thing, but they took it nonetheless, and it is there. But we who needed the money did not get it. So Bridgetown is saying something is wrong there. We need you to pledge back that money into the system to help states deal with climate, with pandemics, and so forth and so on. And I'm happy to say tonight that through the efforts of Barbados' Prime Minister, and some other countries and international stakeholders, that is civil society organizations, the countries agreed to pledge back $100 billion in what is called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, the RST. Well, they've pledged it. I think we've gotten up to Ryan is laughing. We've gotten up to about 60 billion. And they promised that by the end of the year at Paris, again at the Macron-Motley conference, they promised to get to the 100 billion. So our hope is that we will get there by the end of the year. But at least we've seen action on that. We've asked for the provision of increased liquidity support in rechanneling those things through development banks. Because we just don't want it to go into the IMF, where some countries can't get access. Barbados was the first country to access the RST. Yes? So congratulations to Barbados. It was a fight, but we got it done. But many of the countries in the OECS can't access it because to access the RST, you have to have an IMF program. And you know what having an IMF program means. So many countries don't want to get an IMF program, and we're saying to them, look, no. If you're giving me something, give me it. If you're helping me, help me. But don't try to pigeonhole me into something that I don't want or perhaps do not even need in order to get access to resources which you said you want to give to us. So it is a constant battle. Then there's the issue of debt. You know, there's something called death row. Well, we have now coined the term debt row because there are over 50 countries in the world that are literally on debt row who are waiting for the hangman or the executioner to cancel them, because they have high unsustainable debt. And why? Because 60 to 70% of that debt was incurred repairing the damage from climate events and disasters. You've seen it in Pakistan. We know it in Dominica. We know it in Grenada. You've seen it in Pakistan. You've seen it recently in Libya. And we know, for example, that our minister here, Minister Strawn, had to go back to Parliament for $100 million. Had to go to Parliament for $100 million for a little storm, you know. I don't recall what it was called. I don't even remember what it was called. Elsa. We had Elsa. We had Maria. We had Dorian. We had none of the big fish. Thank God, knock on wood. We had Elsa that wiped out a whole section of the housing stock in Barbados. And when minister had to go to Parliament and say, it costs $100 million. I said, $100 million? But if you have to repair, replace houses, it is not inexpensive. If you have to fix bridges and roads and repair other infrastructure, it is not an inexpensive business. So we are saying that there must be a debt deal for small countries. And this is where we believe that organizations like small business sector organizations must come in. And you may say, oh, these are esoteric topics. As people say, oh, this is the fancified, rarefied atmosphere. But trust me, it affects every single citizen in Barbados, in the Caribbean, and in small states generally. Why? Because if the government has to incur debt at exorbitant prices because they can't access resources from the World Bank, from the IMF, from the IDB at good rates, and have to go into private capital markets to borrow, then it means it's less fiscal space that they have to do things that you want. So all of the things that you heard Mr. Chairman Charles speaking about, the digitization, the investment in this, the investment in that, the more money in this, the more money in that, governments can't have it if they don't have the fiscal space. Because as soon as you do that, there's somebody there willing to put a lash in you, whether it's a ratings agency or otherwise. I probably shouldn't mention the word ratings agencies either. But, so we have to mobilize money now. And Bridgetown speaks about mobilizing private sector money because governments can't do it alone. So we need private sector capital mobilization. That's a big one. Because you know what? The big oil companies are the ones that creating most of the emissions. They're the people who are devastating the environment with greenhouse gases. They're the ones who made tremendous and are still making super rents, as they call it in economics, profits, as we call it on the street, from increased oil prices. And all that Bridgetown is saying, and we're saying, look, okay, you've made a lot, but just give us 0.0001% of the however billions of dollars you make a year. If you give us that, we will be able to do the things that are necessary to build resilience and adaptation from the same climate events that you, because of your actions, have caused. This is not an unreasonable thing. And we are calling for a change in the multilateral development institutions like the World Bank, which I sit on. Because I can tell you, and Ryan can tell you, Barbados' experience, when COVID hit and we went, you know, we had to do all kinds of wriggling, and I wasn't there then. But I heard subsequently when I went myself last year. And you know, it went to board because Barbados has graduated. We are supposedly a high-income country. They ain't got no poor people in Barbados, according to these institutions. We ain't got no needs. The tourism we got can finance everything. We got a lot of people living on the West Coast in big billion-dollar villas, and blah, 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 blah. You know what they said? They said to Barbados, we are going to give you this on exceptional access terms. Hear that? Exceptional. But don't come back. Do not come back. That's what was said, you know. Not carrying these things out of tales out of school, but Minister Strong can tell you that is what Barbados was told. So when I landed in the World Bank, and I said to Prime Minister and Ryan, I said, you know, this thing ain't looking too good, you know. We're going to have to go back and get some money to do some climate programming. They had an entire program that they wanted to pursue. Prime Minister said, but you know, the World Bank people said, don't come back. I said, they said, don't come back. Well, they haven't met me. I go in there and ask for it. And we worked together as a team, and there was a lot of pushback. But we would not take no for an answer. We pushed and pushed and pushed until in January of this year, we had 8 abstentions, I think, and 3 or 4 no votes on the first one. But in January this year, we had unanimous support for Barbados' application for concessional financing before the bank in a green policy loan to do work to help Barbados build adaptation and build resilience for climate events in this. So we know that advocacy, strong, in your face, direct, honest advocacy can work in these institutions. But you have to go and you have to do it. And that is why Bridgetown is saying that these organizations have to change, because we should not have to beg. We should not have to plead. We should not have to be told, we can get this, but don't come back. When it's dealing with climate and pandemics and recovering from the learning losses in education, for educational reform and so forth and so on, to support small businesses, to do things for women and so forth and so on, to achieve the SDGs, we should not have to beg. It should be a matter of course. But if you have an institution that was created in the 1940s, when we were not even nation states, sovereign states, there was no Barbados with independence and flag and all that, we were still a colony. So that organization was not designed to serve our purpose. As your title says, it was not fit for a purpose. It was not fit for our purpose. We now have to make it an institution reformed to fit the needs that we have. I want to suggest humbly that you have a role to play in this. Another area, of course, is the issue of climate clauses, pause clauses. We recommended this too. People said, "No, man, we can't do that." But we pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. And now the World Bank has declared that it will do climate clauses in all of its debt instruments. And that was inspired by what Barbados did in its restructuring process. So we know that it can work if we are prepared to be upfront and to do the work that is necessary in advocating this. And therefore, that is why I am calling on your association, your members, to work with national institutions, to work with the government, and to work with other private sector institutions and small business associations across SIDS to build a Caribbean, then a regional Latin America and Caribbean, then a global network to ensure that you forge the change that is necessary in the development space internationally so that we can get our just due when it comes to the whole set of things that we need to address. Then we come to the domestic scene, for example. And this is something that I feel quite passionately about. And in this regard, I want to look at 3 areas in particular very quickly. The first is climate resilience building, which of course is the key one. The second is democratization of finance, which I think your chairman spoke about. And the third is business facilitation and inclusion. Now, you've heard me mention about about climate, and at the risk of boring you, I really do have to make a few points on this, because the technical research and data and advice that we're getting is that businesses in small and vulnerable states and island economies seem not to be as ready for climate events as they ought to be. That is what we are showing. We are being told that in most SIDS, and in the Caribbean in particular, that there's a lack of clearly defined and integrated climate resilient plans within the private sector and the small business sector in particular, and especially among your sectors. In some countries, for example, it is estimated that less than 19% of small businesses have an active adaptation and resilient building plan, while governments have struggled to find finance necessary to assist these firms in putting these plans together. And we have seen in several cases where climate events have taken place the significant impact it has had on your sector. Indeed, in some instances, it has been completely devastating. I know many of you know the serious fallout from plant investment, jobs, and so forth and so on, relative to climate events. And you also know the disruptive elements, as I've said, relative to events that occur in other countries to the supply chain. But the question must be asked, how many small businesses in Barbados and elsewhere have integrated climate resilient plan that have a plan of action before the event occurs and after the event has occurred relative to your recovery? That is the key question that has to be asked. How many businesses have it? Is there a national plan? And if it is a national plan, has that trickled down to each individual business that knows how operations will cease before the event occurs, will manage the fallout from the event, and will ramp back up post-event? How many institutions have that plan? And if the honest answer is that you don't know, then we have a problem. And I think it's a problem, Mr. Chairman, that needs to be seriously addressed. Second point, for example, how many institutions and small organizations, small businesses, either individually or collectively, have negotiated pause clauses with financial institutions, private or public? And I'm not talking about these feel-good, well-to-do, hope you get back on your feet, I'll give you a little break for a few months, but pay me back my money. I'm not talking about it. I'm talking about serious, legally enforceable climate clauses, similar to what Barbados negotiated for, is that for small and medium-sized businesses who have debt instruments with financial institutions. Isn't it logical that if the country has one, then its businesses ought to have one too? And it must not be as the result of corporate magnanimity, if that is actually a concept. How many have sit down with your financial institutions and said, this is how we want to proceed, this is what we want, can you afford to give us that? If that has not yet happened, it is the urgency of now that your association, working with the government advisors in the various entities, and with technical support provided by institutions such as the World Bank and others who like giving that type of technical support, begin to have that addressed. How many of you have the recovery plan in place relative to risk insurance to cover your businesses from the fallout of a climate event? Have you considered working with other small business associations across the Caribbean to do a CRIF-type facility, the Caribbean Risk Insurance Facility, which works so very well for countries? There was exploration of looking, for example, at the fishing industry and whether or not something could be put in place on a parametric, because that is parametric insurance, to looking at putting a parametric system in place where companies who are affected by disaster events can get a helping hand when they need it most. That is when the event has struck. It is something that I think that you should fully consider. Why? Because if you are creating the most jobs, if you are providing the most employment, if your businesses are severely disrupted, who gets the impact first and greatest? Your workers. Not only the entrepreneurs and the owners, they have but the workers get the fallout. So that is why this kind of thing is important, because it speaks to a protection of workers, it speaks to a protection of business, it speaks to an adaptation and a resilience building against climate. We complain in Barbados, no, not me, because I'm not here, but I've heard the complaints. Every time you call home, it's so hot, outside is so hot. Oh, I can't survive this heat. I won't tell you who told me that, but my wife will confirm that it is true. And it is true. But we know that there's global warming. That's not a mystery. So it's going to get hot and hotter. This was the hottest period, I think, summer that we've had ever since they've been recorded. How many small businesses, how many businesses even, but how many small businesses have an integrated plan for dealing with the heat, where their workers are concerned and their systems are concerned? How many people have sat down with the unions, representatives, and others to say, look, we need to shift the work week, we need to shift the work day. Let's start at, rather than starting at 8 o'clock, let's start at 6. Or if you're in a factory where there's a lot of machinery and there's heat, can we start work at 5? Who has done this type of work? I suggest to you humbly that it is absolutely critical that we train our minds to these things, because they are not esoteric subjects anymore, written in some research paper with data and numbers and indices and so forth and so on. It is a real life experience for ordinary citizens. Because we know, for example, that when the results, the preliminary results are showing from the World Bank and others, are shown in the ILO, and it will show that when a review is done of this last few months across the world, and in particular in developing countries, this heat is likely to cause a fall in productivity. That is just simply an expectation that we know is coming. We cannot afford to have a fall in productivity at this time. We are already starting from too far behind. We need to have these systems put in place, and I suggest, please, that you begin to work assiduously on this thing. The second area is on financing. Yeah? Yes. I don't presume to lecture you on finance, because I know that you know that for small businesses, accessing finance is a nightmare, right? It's like pulling teeth from a blackbird, as we would say in Barbados. It is extremely difficult. But there are 2 areas that I want to highlight tonight. The first relates to the issue, and I'm going to thread very carefully here, because I just know how this thing goes. And therefore, I'm not speaking about Barbados specifically. Let the media know that very clearly, because I know how this goes. I'm speaking about SIDS generally. Don't you find it a little odd that the empirical data is showing everywhere that small and medium-sized businesses are not getting equal access or sufficient access to finance that they require to make their businesses grow, to do innovation, as the chairman said, to bring that innovative entrepreneurial spirit out. Yet, in juxtaposition to that reality, we have one of the most liquid, and I'm saying this with a smile, looking at the president of the Bridgetown Cooperative Credit Union, and some others who have sat on the board. That we have a cooperative, non-bank financial sector that has substantial amounts of resources in their coffers, on their books. And trust me, I know all of the prudential rules. I know all of the regulatory and the legislative issues that you face. I know this, having served as Minister of Finance and had responsibility for credit unions and cooperatives. But wouldn't you agree that the time has come for a serious conversation to take place? That while small black, I'm saying black, businesses in our space, in small island developing states, have to fish around, beg around, and plead around with institutions, some of whom are foreign, not indigenous, and do not have that connection, fraternal or paternal connection to us, to give us resources to activate, to motivate, and to advance our small and medium-sized businesses that we know from the figures create the most jobs, generate the greatest level of economic activity, and contribute in some instances up to 70% of GDP. We have to go and ask them for money. But our sector that we build, that we own, that manage all resources are hemmed in by prudential rules and legislation and policies and everything to keep them in an estrangement away from you. I am saying tonight that that is a fundamental injustice. So if we want to have inverse reparations, we call that word, let's have inverse reparations, where small and medium-sized businesses are able to access these resources. And I know, Dr. Holder, that you and others have been doing a lot to try to see where in small bits it can happen. But we need a big transformative attempt. I saw, and I'm not going to get in it because I don't know anything about it, the Energy Co-op thing that they're doing with the $100 million to transform the sugar industry. I'm not getting into all of that. But I just want to make the point, because I heard the figure of $100 billion. Could you imagine, Mr. Head of Export, Caribbean Export, if in any of our small island developing states, small and medium-sized businesses could get access to $100 million to do things? Could you imagine the kind of jobs that you would create around here, the kind of innovation you would span, the type of economic activity you would generate, the type of GDP you would spur, the type of economic development in education, in just energy transformation, in alternative energy? Could you imagine what 100 million $100 million would do in an economy such as we find in small and medium-sized businesses in cities? It would be like a good bomb in the middle of a quiet storm. I am saying tonight that it is a conversation whose time has come, because we owe it to our own legacy. We owe it to our own future. We owe it to our children to ensure that that culture of risk averseness is broken. And it can only be broken if we break it. So I leave it with you. I am in Washington, D.C., hanging out in an office, but I leave all those difficult questions to you. But I know that you know it has to be done. And that brings me to the other point on finance. Because the studies, and the Inter-American Development Bank has done a study recently on financing small firms. And you know what they found? They found that, no surprise though, anyhow, they found that women, female-headed entrepreneurs, businesses are having, I don't even know what to call it, gripe. You know when a baby got gripe? And you gotta get gripe water? How hard the baby's hard when it got gripe? Is it like women having the gripe to get access to finance? But you know what? It is the women that are creating the most businesses in the world right now. It's the women who have the best credit risk profiles, but the ones who can't get money. And the study has found, go read it, that in SIDS and in some parts of the Caribbean, that women can only get loans if they turn up with a man. Or if they have another partner, that a woman-led institution, a woman-led business cannot get, even if it has an excellent idea, an innovative product that can sell and that can do well, or service, they can't get access to this. That is why I must say, and the PS is here from the ministry, and I must say, that is why the government's effort on the Trust Loan Fund Limited is such a progressive one, because they try to cut through a lot of that to try to get the money to people who really matter most, which are women. And that's why we talk about financial inclusion. Financial inclusion. The studies have shown if you give the women the money, they will create sustainable businesses. They will create jobs for more women. We will achieve SDG 5, which is gender equality. And we will not be falling behind in these things. I am saying we have to do. The time is now. We have no excuse not to have this kind of financing going to women who have proven that they can run businesses and do them well. So I'm calling on the SCA tonight, your role in this whole development, you have to push this even more than you've been pushing it now. You have to open up a national conversation on this issue. We can no longer hide behind statistics and all that kind of thing and the fancy talk. Ordinary people. So if the government is provisioning $28 million for the trust loan fund, private sector institutions, financial and otherwise, including credit unions or cooperatives, let me say cooperatives, need to be able to match the government. So if the government is putting out $30 million, you put 32. So 30 and 30, $60 million. Imagine what that could do to create jobs, to create opportunity, to push innovation, and so forth and so on, to fight poverty in our society. We can no longer shrink back from these big, important questions, and I urge you to push forward. I want also to finally speak on the issue of trade facilitation and trade and business facilitation. You know, this is a big topic, and Minister Cummings, we have a soft spot for these things, right? So, because we're international trade, trained international trade specialists. But again, the research is showing it. Small island development states, SIDS, are the ones who suffer the greatest when our trade systems do not work. And I know my friend from Export Barbados knows this even better than I do. When we have a port that is clogged up and that things can't get through there from ship to shop, when we have along the value chain disruptions, delays, inertia, these things add a cost to the eventual consumer. You know, a lot of people look at tariffs and they look at the taxes and so forth and so on, but they don't look at the costs along the way in the value chain. From the time it leaves where it leaves, the raw materials or the finished product or the semi-finished product, through the port that it sits down in a port, for example, and you can't get it out because this agency is not functioning, that agency is not functioning. We know, who are in trade policy, we know that that chain of increased cost ends up at our tables, ends up in our wardrobes, ends up in our kitchen cupboards. And therefore, it is important that we be motivated to implement, to reform, and to transform the systems which we have relative to trade facilitation. The WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, we are signatories to it, and we have been doing some excellent work. I know here in Barbados, from my work in a different sphere, on putting together teams. Not sure if the Small Business Association is on it, but put together teams to look at it, to go through it line by line by line by line, so that we can implement. But that can also, and needs to be done, in collaboration with other countries in the Caribbean and other SIDS, so that we get best practice at every stage. We share the costs and be able to move goods, and goods in particular, around the region, through the region, and into the region at the cheapest possible cost to us and the less disruption to us. And the sooner, the faster we get to doing that. We have the electronic single window, which is a tremendous piece of thing. And you know, that ties into the whole issue of digitization, which is a big issue because there's a major digital divide between developed countries and developing countries. And I'll tell you something. The process of COVID showed it. You know, we have more cell phones than we got a population. There are more cell phones in Barbados than we got people, you know. There are more landline connections in Barbados than you got houses, you know. It's a fact. But it's a fact that some houses, well, not now, baby, some houses had two lines in them. You know, like when brother and sister in the house, and you know, brother don't talk, or brother want court all night with some girl, sister want to get a call from a colleague, so I ain't gonna put in a telephone line. So we had more lines, and we have more cell phones. But you know what? You know what COVID showed? Having access to WhatsApp, having a cell phone, a smartphone, having access to WhatsApp, that is not closing any digital divide, you know. There are a lot of people who believe that because we have access to cell phones, and a lot of young people walk around cell phones, but we found in COVID, when COVID struck in many of our countries, that a lot of them didn't know how to use them. Otherwise, in fact, I'll tell you this, it is a reality, because international research shows it, that 90% of the systems on smartphones are not used. People buy I got a smartphone, but it's only used two. I use the call in and the call out. But I don't know about the rest. My daughter may know this, my son knows this. But 90% of the things on there, they got a lot of program. And at some point in time, when you're doing the upgrades, messages come. You have apps on here that you're not using. Do you want to delete them? I said, well, sure, go right ahead. So we know from COVID, when COVID struck, we didn't have laptops, we didn't have tablets, we didn't have these things to deliver the teaching. We didn't have to scramble and do it. So we know the digital divide is real, and it is costly to fill. But we have, in the context of doing that, to understand that we need to upgrade our systems. That's why the electronic single window is so important. It is really one of the breakthroughs for us. And we have to be able to ensure that such is done. And then finally, I really must make this point for you tonight, because I think to do so will be remiss of me, and I know my colleagues at the bank will not be very happy at all. Do you remember the Doing Business report? Do you remember the Doing Business report that used to be all over the place, and people used to be, which score you got, and Barbara just dropped 5 brains, and this body gone up 2, and you can't get this done, and so forth and so on? Well, you know that report ran into difficulties in 2018, 2019, and I'm not going to go over that. I really am not going to go over that. But I must tell you the story, because when I was minister, honestly, I had some challenge with that report. I think one of the major challenges I had with the report was how the data was being collected and who was being positioned, because nobody knew. If you ask them, but where you got this information? I remember one day, a chap who was head of the land registry, I mean, he almost burst the blood vessel when he read the report, because it said that it took 3 or 4 weeks to register a title. He knew that. He knew in his department, but it only took a day, 2 days, once the documents are available. And he asked me, he said, Minister, you have to, so we asked for a meeting. And the bank officials came on, and we questioned them about the indices that they were using, about the comparative methodologies they were using, the weight system, the weighting system. Yeah? Because, for example, you measuring me against the United States, who have bigger staff, all these technical people, and you're saying it takes the United States 2 weeks to get a town planning approval, but in Barbados it takes 2 months or 2 years. But you got to tell me which type of approval you're talking about. You have to tell me, did the business apply first? Because you know some businesses write a letter, but they don't already apply. Minister Strong will tell you that. They got a lot of businesses that go out there and talk to the people that they come and say, but I applied, but you didn't really apply. And so forth and so on. So we asked, and so I had my difficulties with it, long and short. Anyway, it collapsed in 2018 on on a whole set of issues, and it became a big international incident, and lawyers had to be called in and so forth. The long and short is that a review was done, and it was found to be significant flaws in the way in which they went about doing this doing business report. But I must tell you that a complete review and reform of the product has been done. And in May of this year, the World Bank announced that the business ready, that's what it's now called, be ready, you hear that term, be ready, project to improve upon the displaced doing business report is going to come out next year. So what's new? They have greater consideration for the role of public services, balanced coverage of the de jure and de facto aspects of business environment, including adding firm surveys, new data sourcing, complement from expert consultations. They're going to go to governments, they're going to go to private sectors, they're going to go to civil society, they're going to do a whole lot of consultations. All topics will be structured on the 3 pillars: regulatory framework, public services, efficiency. And the scoring will be based on firm flexibility and social benefits. So they're including social benefits now, which wasn't in the previous report. So they're going to be assessing indicators such as business entry, location, utility services, labor, financial services, international trade, taxation, dispute resolution, market competition, business insolvency, and so forth, and so on. And within each indicator, Be Ready will include data on 3 component considerations of the modern economy: digital, adoption, environmental, sustainability, gender, participation. Here where they're going? So all the things that I just mentioned are going to be in the new assessment for that report. And so I have to tell you that the 2 countries up first, Barbados and Jamaica, in 2024, followed in 2025 by Antigua, Canada, and Grenada, and then in the 3rd edition in 2026, Bahamas, Belize, and Guyana. That's from our constituency. So the report is coming. And I want to tell you a little story. Again, not taking things out of school. I was walking down the thing going to a meeting, and I saw one of my officers rushing, coming, the senior advisor, coming to me. He said, "Yeah, I have to talk to you now." So I stopped. I said, "Well, what's the problem, Mark?" He said, "You know, that we've gone through this entire process of redoing the Do Business with Dog. At that time, it was called the Business Enabling Environment Report, BEE. So they changed it now to Be Ready is the final name." He says, "But you know, they've excluded the Caribbean. There are no Caribbean countries who are going to be assessed." I said, "Oh, how could that be? But we went through this thing from start to finish. You mean at the final stages when it going to the board, they just nixed the Caribbean out of it?" He said, "Yes. I just came from the technical meeting because they have said they're not doing assessments in countries that have a population less than 1.5 million people. That means the entire constituency that we represent practically gone." So you see how these people think. It is not just mental, it's mentalities. Because as far as they're concerned, we didn't matter. But we went to board and fought that. And luckily, we have been included. So I am saying to you tonight, don't let us down, please. All of us have to work. And I'm encouraging the Small Business Association to put its systems in place. I know Minister Cummings is going to lead an effort in that particular regard because it is that important to us, because it determines not just cost, but confidence of investors, both foreign and domestic, in investing in Barbados. And whatever problems we had with the previous report or what ranking we had, we have to ensure that we get the highest possible ranking because we are up first. So let's set the stage for that. And as the name goes, be ready. And so in closing, let me once again thank all of you for your reputation. I'm sorry I had to be as long as I am, but I don't get opportunities now like before to get on platforms and talk, and hold the podium, and do my thing. Those are privileges of the past. And so I really want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so, and I trust that the information and the reflections and whatever little ideas that I may have been able to share with you will be of some value so that you can continue to play a tremendous role in the development dimension of our system to ensure that we push ahead and become an even better set of societies in these small, vulnerable, very vulnerable island economies that we have the honor to live in and to represent. I'm much obliged to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sinckler. You took full advantage of the opportunity on stage tonight. We want to thank you on behalf of the SBA for a very comprehensive representation of the crises that the world faces and the deleterious impact on small island developing states like us, and then challenging Dr. Holder and Mr. Carter and the other members of the SBA as to how perhaps they need to reposition themselves to help respond to these challenges and withstand the shocks. We have limited time for questions. We're going to spend 15 minutes taking your questions. We need you to please indicate by a show of hand if you want to ask a question. I will acknowledge you, and we ask you to be succinct. Be sure to get the microphone from our usher as well, because we are recording. So who is going to open the batting tonight with the questions? Thank you, sir. Go right ahead. We have a question up front here. Oh, okay. Let me give you my mic, if you don't mind. You need to speak through the mic.
Yeah, pleasant good evening, everybody. I just wanted to thank you, sir, for your very succinct and you were able to capture, because I know you have the capacity to stay here all night, but you mentioned the matter of advocacy, and I saw it listed as one of the things that the Small Business Association is so much a part of. And Minister Cummins know it better than I, but when I served at the BCSI, it was about ensuring that we provide advocacy. So in your thesis, you said it was important, and I believe it is the that linchpin in terms of getting a greater voice. So if you could just, tell us a little bit in terms of how that works, and particularly this particular economy and making things happen, because I believe it is absolutely very, very important and critical.
Yeah, well, I think, thank you very much for that. In many respects, we labor under the impression that things just happen, yeah? And that if we leave them alone, it will correct itself. For example, we believe the market, through market forces, will self-correct, and those days are over. Things just don't happen, and bad things don't correct themselves. You have to intervene. And the first stanza in intervention is to advocate what the issue is. You have to be clear in thought as to what you know should happen, what you want to have happen, and how it should happen. And then you have to go speak to the people you know pull the levers to get it happen. And I'm saying that, for example, on the pause clauses, that we are now getting the bank to agree, and they're not fully there yet, because I got a battle with them when I go back. But at least we know that if we had not, that has been around for a long time, that's not new. But you know what? Nobody was taking us on with it until we put it on the agenda. And Barbados and Grenada and some other countries in the Caribbean did the same thing. Once we put it in our systems, we were able to then go and say to them, look, we have done this. We know this can work. And if we can get private sector entities to agree to this, why would multilateral development banks not want to give it? But that advocacy has to take place. If you're not there, if you're not present, trust me, I've been doing this for a long time because I work in civil society organization. I was director of CPDC, so I know if you don't go, and people say, well, you're traveling a lot, and trust me, when I was at CPDC, not in government, when I was in CPDC, we used to always have a little joke in the office that we travel, the only place that we haven't gone is where a plane couldn't land. But the reason why we had to do those things, because you have to be there. If you are not there, people do not take you on. You can't send them a WhatsApp message. You can't send them an email. They'll either not read it or they'll read it and stoops. But when you are in the room and you are putting a case for the country and the program that you represent, people have to deal with you. And trust me, when they see you walk through the door and you see them stoops, oh man, he again or she again, you know you're getting through to them. Because the message, they don't want to confront you. Because they can ghost you if you are not there. For want of a better term, young people use ghost you. But we shall not be ghost because we are going. And Professor Stiglitz once did, and Andrew Charlton once did, a massive study. And you know what they said? Part of the problem with developing countries is that they don't set the agenda because they're not there when the agenda is being set. You have to be there. So the advocacy is necessary.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, we have a question over here. Thank you.
Let me say thank you also for your presentation. You didn't touch on this issue of insurance, but the whole thing of reinsurance as a result of climate change and these disasters and so forth is placing a heavy burden on small businesses and medium-sized businesses. Is there anything that the institution is looking at that could assist small islands in this area?
Yes, from the World Bank side, there is a risk insurance facility. Of course, CRIF is a combination of the World Bank, IDB, and some others that we have put together, and it is one of the leading parametric insurance models in the region. It started out for governments and for countries, but we now have to advocate to ensure that it can now come down to companies, businesses, and sectors in particular, so that you don't have to face the full brunt of the reinsurance industry, which can be extremely difficult. We agree with that. Even in instances where you have not been struck by a disaster. Because if a disaster occurs in Bahamas and the recovery rates have to be X or Y billion dollars, it is going to blow back on us. So that is why I mentioned the issue of CRIF, because I feel that the associations across the Caribbean need to band together and put a proposal to the CRIF's executives to see if that can be done. From the bank side, we are going to expand that insurance facility to ensure that we can bring other regional development banks on board and therefore make it bigger and better and more accessible.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Good night, Chris. During your presentation, I think you mentioned something to the extent that Barbados has been graduated. Barbados is a developing country. I don't want to graduate to what? It's certainly not a developed country. But I would like to ask you specifically, what has Barbados benefited from being a member of the World Bank? Give me 3 big things that Barbados have benefited from the World Bank.
Thank you. Well, that can be answered in 2 phases. You know, there are 2 phases to this. There was a period when we were not graduated, and then there was a period where we were graduated. A lot of the schools that you've seen, and we've been the members of the World Bank for over 50 years. So a lot of in the early days, a lot of the infrastructure, physical infrastructure, a lot of the schools, secondary and primary schools, roads and so forth and so on, a lot of that was done with World Bank money. And it came at highly concessional rates. Then, you know, because we got penalized, so to speak, because of our progress. We started to do well, our economy started to grow, our GNP, our GDP per capita went up. I think we're around $17,000 now, US. And because of that, we are classified in the system as what we call a high-income country. And the World Bank was designed, they say, to deal with extreme poverty. And therefore, you cannot have countries that are high-income countries accessing low-income country resources. Because the more money we give to countries like Barbados and Bahamas and Maldives, the less money we're going to have for the Democratic Republic of Congo and Burundi and so forth and so on. So that is the battle that is now going on. However, what has transpired is that the multiple crises that we've been facing, which are now coming with such rapidity. You know, one time we could predict the business cycle 10 years. 1970s, early 1970s, down, recovery, early 1980s, bang, down, recovery, mid-80s, early 90s, bang, recession. No, it's not coming like that. It's coming every 5 years, or it's coming every 2 years. It's coming every year. It's coming every 6 months. You don't know what the next crisis is. And we're saying to the bank and others, okay, we can no longer just be classified as high-income country because there are other fundamentals in our country that need to be addressed, which are structural issues that we have coming out of colonialism. And that is what we are fighting at the bank. So in terms of benefits, yes, in terms of benefits, if we can get back in there, we will be able to get access to resources at the lowest possible rates to do the big things around here, like build infrastructure, repair infrastructure that need to repair bridges and roads, build schools, and do other things. Do our water systems that need to be repaired, the billions of dollars we have to spend on water infrastructure to replace old and aging and leaking mains, where a substantial proportion of our water is leaking into the ground. They call non-revenue water. If we can get access to those resources, we can do that, and that is why we are pushing. So there's a reason why we are in the World Bank and why we are pushing this on a daily basis.
We have time for one more question. Who's going to take it? Well, if there are no takers, I'm going to use my moderator's privilege and ask you a question, sir. And it is, you know, small businesses, every day you hear of the struggles that small businesses face. I mean, at the domestic level, in their businesses, etc. How realistically can they take on the magnitude of these global issues? I mean, you made the point that they should perhaps negotiate pause clauses to deal with climate change issues and other disasters. But then you also acknowledge that they have serious challenges getting finance, accessing finance. So if you can't get in the door to get the finance, how are you going to negotiate a pause clause? It just seems like so much burden on these already burdened small businesses.
Well, that's a very good question, but you know, life is never easy.
No, it's not.
And therefore, you have to try. Because the issue is that, and again, it comes back to Henderson's question on advocacy. You have to push for that change. You have to push at every level. You have to push at the government level. You have to push at the private sector level. You have to push at the union level. You have to push internationally once you have identified what the things are that you need. But most importantly, you have to push yourself. You have to be able to chew gum and walk. You have to say, I'm going to deal with this issue. I have a business problem. I have to deal with this. I have to deal with my workers. I have to deal with getting inputs. I have to deal with getting equipment. This is broken down and that is broken down. But at the end of the day, I also have a responsibility to band together with my fellow business people through my association to ensure that these issues are put on the table, because unless I get people to change their attitudes, their mentalities, and their interventions, I'm not going to solve any of those little day-to-day problems that I have. So as former Prime Minister Owen Arthur used to say, it has to be a lived experience. You have to face it and fix it. And that is the issue that we have for small businesses to deal with. So don't let small just is a term that they use, but you're not small, you are very big, because the contribution which you make is oversized for the smallness that they claim that you have.
Face it, fix it, get involved. Thank you very much. Let's give him another round of applause for what was indeed a very elucidating lecture tonight. Thank you very much, Minister. Remain on stage. We're going to invite the President of the SBA, Dr. Lynette Holder, to show us our gratitude, or to show you, rather, the SBA's gratitude, and she's going to present you with a gift.
That's right. You need to hold it for us, normally. This piece is presented compliments of Medford Mahogany Creations. I believe Reggie is in the audience. Yes, there you go. Barbadian Mahogany.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations. Thank you so
Appreciate
much,
it.
Minister.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Mr. Singh.